Welcome to Holder 539 Steampunk Artsy and Crafts Nerf whatever. You can insert your electric boogaloo jokes right here, and today we are going to do something with this modeling plastic and those lenses, and our aim will be to build a scope for this Nerf pistol. Not a really functioning or useful scope, mind you, just one that looks cool and steampunky. I don't really know anything about this kind of modeling plastic, and I'm using it for the first time, so this should be interesting. The only thing I know is that to harden it, you put it into the oven and bake it, and while I may not know anything about modeling plastic, I know a thing or two about getting baked, so we should be fine.
Attention, this is an announcement from the New World Order. Please remain calm and stay seated while we are injecting subliminal messages. Welcome to the cabinet of the strange and macabre.
When building the scope for the Nerf, I decided to get some inspiration from the local flea market. And by inspiration, I mean the pair of binoculars I used to get the lenses. As you can see in the video, this pair of binoculars was a pretty old one, and that whole aesthetic with the rusted and banged up metal rings and the parts made of actual wood was exactly what I was going for. It also only set me back about 10 euros, so for a pair of binoculars that we are going to destroy anyway in a moment, there is absolutely no harm in going with some banged up looking second-hand tat. Except maybe for the little but not unimportant fact that the entire contraption was so rusted up that I not only broke one of my screwdrivers trying to unscrew the bloody thing, but I had to straight up pull apart some of those metal rings. Some of the parts I had to remove even disintegrated into a whitish, fibery, powder-like substance, which I really hope was not some sort of old-timey poisonous building material. But I'm still recording this audio about a month later, so guess I got lucky. Anyhow, a slight disappointment was that it wasn't really possible to separate the two halves of the binoculars in the middle. If that would have been the case, I'd probably just have taken one half, painted it copper and glued it atop the gun. But as you can see, it wasn't. So I actually had to use that round thingy which sits there on my neck and mostly serves as an excuse to wear a hat. At the end of the process of taking those binoculars apart, I ended up with, as well as two small ones complete with their wooden sockets and metal rings. I also still have the main part from the middle, and I'll keep that for use in a later project because it looks kind of cool. You will also have noticed that we have a surplus of two lenses, at least, if we are going for any construction that actually serves as a useful scope. As I mentioned earlier, we are not doing that, so I will actually use 3 of the lenses in my design. But before we use them for anything, we should probably clean them first. Now that we have most of our basic materials, namely the glass parts which we can't manufacture ourselves, we have officially reached the creative part of the video. And this has to do with the poor man's alternative to 3D printing, Polymer-Clay, or how it is known in my country by the name of the most commonly found brand, Fimo. As you will see in a second here, Fimo is a sort of plasticky modeling clay which you can harden in the oven. It comes in a variety of colors, although I'd suggest that if you are going to paint it, you should probably go with a black version, because it saves the time and resources you'd otherwise spend later to buy and apply black primer. Another thing that's commonly found in many hobby stores next to the Fimo is a wide variety of little chisels and other instruments you can use to form the mess. although more economically minded individuals like myself can save a few bucks by just using a butter knife and a bunch of small screwdrivers. Those will pretty much serve the same purpose just fine. And you should also probably invest in some rubber gloves, because Fimo stains your hands. Otherwise, this stuff's pretty much malleable like plasticine, and a good way to create some basic forms, like in our case with the new sockets for the lenses, is to just form it around a solid object like the lenses or the Nerf itself, and then remove it carefully, so you're left with kind of a wobbly negative of the object that you encased in Fimo. This way it's pretty easy to create a basic form for the object that you're modeling. Due to the properties of the polymer clay, you can just add random parts to that basic form, or you could even put it in the oven and harden it before you apply a second layer. I actually decided for the latter of the two options, because it proved quite challenging to first produce a form that fit the part of the gun it is supposed to go on later, and then have the soft mass remain in that form while we're adding further details. At this point, it might be smart to tell you something about how to harden Fimo. There usually is an instruction sheet with every pack you buy, but in case you've lost yours for some reason, well, guess you're lucky that you found this random YouTube video, aren't you? Hardening the mass will take a temperature of 110 degrees Celsius or 230 degrees Fahrenheit if you're living in one of those confusing countries where the measurement systems are all fucked up. After about 30 minutes, you should remove the now almost hardened parts from the oven to cool off. The packaging, by the way, warns not to leave the parts in for too long or turn the oven on too hot, because something noxious fumes. You should probably open up a window or something. Or, you know, just follow the instructions. I mean, I managed to do it without killing myself, so you also should be able to do so. What the packaging doesn't tell you, however, or at least I didn't pick up on it initially, is that in the oven, the shape and size of some parts may warp slightly. In cases where that's a problem, however, you can of course combat it by filing the parts down or adding a second layer of clay and putting them back into the oven. Since after the first 2 rounds of hardening, the sockets for the lenses didn't line up properly, I had to do exactly that. I'd say it's not that much of a problem though, since especially if you're working with an already hardened basic form, adding details or correcting height or length of a part is not that much of a challenge. To do so, it's oftentimes wise to just take a small glob of the clay, flatten it into a plate or roll it into a string, and then just finagle it to the part where you want it to stick before reintroducing the whole thing to the oven. Now that you're initiated into the art of using frickin' modeling clay, let me get in some comments on my design before we move on to the next part. First off, I decided to make 2 of 3 sockets for the lenses actually half circles instead of full ones, because I kind of wanted to emulate the style of the scopes from the improvised weapons from Fallout 4 which I was playing at the time. And I think I didn't do that bad of a job in creating a steampunk version of that. But if you want to go for less improvised looking and more streamlined design, the only limit is of course your imagination and ability to form modeling clay. If you're willing to invest some time and maybe bring a butter knife with a broader blade, it's also possible to make much smoother parts than I did. But then again, they are supposed to fit our Nerf steampunk design, so I actually made sure not to work too precisely. It's hard to see due to my camera quality, but some of the parts I actually scratched up with a screwdriver so they'd actually match the texture of the gun better. And lastly, in this part, I did something rather stupid, which you can avoid with some foresight. That's why I'm going to warn you about it. You might have noticed that at one point in the time-lapse footage, I used some super glue to glue 2 parts of a broken up looking piece together, and then I put it back into the oven to harden on the second layer of Fimo that I've placed above it. Now, I'm of course not a chemist or even that knowledgeable about the composition of polymer clay or super glue, But putting the already glued part back into the oven seemed like a really stupid idea even when I did it, and I really didn't think that it would work out that well. So if you can avoid doing that, you should probably avoid doing that. After this little PSA, let's move on to the next step. Now that all the parts we are going to use are correctly hardened and cooled off, it is time to paint them. For that, I'll of course use the same colors as for the body of the gun, and since buying a 4-pack of those Reefs acrylic paints has gotten us pretty far, especially looking at the size of the pieces we have painted so far, I didn't even have to spend any additional money. And since so far I have used the black Fimo, we don't even have to bother with any primer. With all the creative control I this time had over the shape of the pieces that I was going to paint, I gave myself a much easier time than I had when painting the actual Nerf parts like this round magazine thingy. For that reason, and since most of the parts were pretty small, I this time mostly stuck to using a regular brush like a normal human being instead of my usual weird finger painting technique. In terms of painting tips, the only thing I have for you this time is, as always, not to try to actually Bob Ross this shit and do the entire paint job in one go, because even with the much more defined and three-dimensional shapes of our homemade parts, there are still a lot of awkward transitions and nooks and crannies on those things, let me tell you that. And also, contrary to regular painting in doing mock weaponry and props, there actually are no lucky mistakes, just regular mistakes. So just take the time and let one layer of paint dry before applying the next one, especially when it's a different color right next to one that you've just applied. Luckily, however, it seems though that acrylic paint dries exceptionally well on polymer clay, and most of the time I managed to have the layers of paint dry before the colors in my color palette did. Overall, this step was much less time consuming than the painting I did in the first part of this video, and I pretty much recorded the entire paint job on one afternoon/evening. After I was done with the paint job, I of course once more headed outside to apply varnish to the painted parts, so the paint job wouldn't scratch or flake off while fastening the parts to the gun or using it later. And also because I once more needed this nice metallic sheen you get when applying the half glossy varnish to our metallic acrylic paints. Sadly, in my part of the world, it is late autumn till early winter right now, and it's getting dark pretty early, so I had to film the riveting applying the varnish sequence in total darkness, and I ended up not using much of it. So, when you're here just to see me apply varnish to stuff, then sorry, but you'll have to go back and watch part 1 again, or something. Freaking weirdo. Anyhow, next! Before we get to all the varnishy goodness, however, I should maybe mention before that I assembled all the push-fit type connections before spraying the whole thing with the varnish for 2 reasons. First off, that I was using regular super glue to keep the entire construction together, and I really didn't know how good that stuff would go together with the varnish. And I didn't quite have enough of either of those substances to do like a proper test run. Also, having those parts stand up vertically gave me the opportunity to reach all sides with my spray can, so I won't complain. You should remember though to not also put in the lenses at this point already, because you won't want to varnish those.
Dry, my pretties, dry! Yeah, I took the pieces inside to dry. For the rest of the varnish, it's kind of getting too cold outside to have them fully dry out there. So yeah, here we have our pieces plus varnish, and I didn't apply any varnish to the undersides of the pieces, but those will be glued to the gun anyway, so it might actually be beneficial not to put any varnish on the pieces we'll actually glue together. And also, I'm nearly out of varnish.
In the last step, we now insert the lenses into the varnished and dried plastic parts of our scope, and then we glue it to the top of the gun. As you can see, the lens in the back fits perfectly, and even the threading pretty much nicely fits into the negative mold we have made. Despite that, however, I also liberally applied super glue, because we want the Nerf to be able to still fire without all our newly added parts falling off at the slightest sign of stress. The same thing goes for the connections between the gun and our homemade parts. Even if we fashioned those to fit the Nerf more or less perfectly, I mentioned earlier that they slightly warped when in the oven, and you really can't be thorough enough when trying to get those things to stick, so here I also used some of the super glue. This, however, also means that we can't open up the Nerf again, and before doing this step you should make sure that the innards of the gun are in perfect working order, because as I said earlier, this is a point of no return for this mod. And lastly, I want to let you in on a little secret, just in case you actually want to build a scope that works, as in allows you to zoom in on shit. And that secret is of course to just stick to 2 lenses and leave off the one in the middle. I actually thought about doing so, because then the scope would still work as 1/2 of a pair of binoculars, so a regular telescope I guess. But then again, I had already built the 3rd socket, and uneven numbers of lenses just look so cool. So if you choose to go with my exact design, I just wouldn't recommend trying to use the scope to actually aim, but then again, a Nerf shoots like about 25 meters, so if you're having actual trouble hitting your target on that distance, I'd think about buying a pair of glasses instead. Hello everybody, welcome to the wrap up. This is the end of the video, this is the end of part 2 actually, so I just wanted to show you how our finished product looks in the end. So yeah, now I can't say of myself that I have a magic gun and I didn't purchase that anywhere, but I built it myself, kind of. Or I just took a toy gun from the store and painted it. But yeah, it is powered by some runes and the might of fucking triangles and squiggly lines and all that good stuff. So now, just to end the demonstration and show that I kept my promise from the beginning of part 1. This gun is still able to shoot, and I'm just thinking about shooting the camera, but the tripod... oh, okay. The tripod didn't fall, so kudos to my tripod, and I really don't look forward to going and looking for those arrows again, because oh my, one of them just landed behind my computer, so yeah. Let me just fire off one more shot, so this should suffice to demonstrate that this Nerf gun is in fact still able to shoot. And as I mentioned before, looking through the scope doesn't really do much, but if you wanted to build a scope that actually works, just don't put in a 3rd lens, although look how cool it looks. If I were you, then I'd really still stick to the 3rd lens. I mean, who needs a scope anyway? It's a fucking Nerf gun. But yeah, this concludes the first part of this. I don't know if it's going to be a series, but this type of video where I kind of construct stuff from things you can get at the hobby store. I still have some residual Fimo, so maybe I'll do something with that in the next video. You are welcome to send me suggestions if you want to have me like build a statue, a really small, really ugly statue from the rest of the Fimo. Just comment below. You can do that anyway. Maybe if you just want to tell me how bloody nice this hat is looking. I sadly didn't do a making of this hat, but it's a nice hat. And while we're on the topic of nice things, I mentioned earlier that I had to go to a flea market with a small antiquities section to get the pair of binoculars I used for the scope, and there I also found this
this really nice decorative dagger, and it's blunt, of course. But yeah, now I bought this dagger. I don't really know why. Guess I'll be hanging it somewhere on my wall, and join the club of people with questionable beards and Renaissance fair / mall swords. I actually have like kind of a mall sword over there. Yeah, this kind of should be the end of the video, since there isn't really anything to give credit for. There won't be a credit sequence, and I'll in fact be just putting them over my face right now. So if you don't see credits at the moment, then the editor is a lazy fuck, and I already know he is, because I am the editor. So yeah, and now I have to kind of get up and reach over really awkwardly to turn off the camera. So this has been the Cabinet of the Strange and Macabre, and I'm the artist mostly referred to as Herder539. Goodbye, everybody.